But using a child as a sounding board or to regulate or to hold the parent's disappointment or sadness, that's the misuse of a child. It's not what a child's psyche is designed to handle. Children are not made to soothe their parents or reassure them or fill their egos or take care of them. So let's talk about this. Because this is an important thing to be clear on, which is this mixed or hybrid sort of family role. There is no family role. I've almost never seen a person that's just one, it's only a scapegoat. More often than not, these things overlap. The fixer who is a golden child, the truth teller who is a scapegoat. Many of you are watching this and saying, hell yeah, lady, I am absolutely more than one of these for sure. Keep in mind, that's common. Then you may go deeper and take notice that you take on different roles, or you took on different roles in your family based on the different people, the different parents. For those of you who grew up in that special nightmare of having two narcissistic parents, or perhaps a narcissistic parent and some other significant narcissist in the family system, such as a grandparent or other significant adult when you were a child, or as you get older, your parent and maybe a sibling, you know that you could have been one role to one parent and another role to another. You might have been a golden child for your father and a scapegoat for your mother. You might have been a fixer for your father and an invisible child to a mother. And that confuses matters so much more, because in some ways you were jumping between two roles, and as an adult, if you had two roles, you're a scapegoat for one and you're a handmaid for another, that's impossible enough. For a child, for you, it was paralyzing. Your roles may have also shifted with age. A really cute little baby or really cute little kid may have once been the golden child. Once, that portability and convenience and cuteness of the little kid fades, the child may become more of an invisible child and get replaced in the golden child role by a new, cute, younger sibling. Or that golden child who decides to stop being the championship soccer player or basketball player may slowly become the scapegoat because they are no longer delivering narcissistic supply. The truth teller child can easily become a scapegoat. The handmaid can become a golden child. Remember, these roles are also functional on the basis of how much supply they give. These roles shift on the basis of the narcissistic supply they do deliver and continue to deliver to the parents. So, as an example, a truth teller child may actually be really good at school, and that brings validation to the parent. The kid keeps getting awards or something like that. But the parent also doesn't like that the truth teller kid really gets them, and may vacillate between scapegoating that child in private and then bragging about that child in public. The two-faced role a child might find themselves stuck in, a public role and a private role, is confusing, painful, and can be very shameful. The child who's so happy they're carrying that trophy and they see their parents' proud face in the audience hopes this time it will last. But then they know, more often than not, they'll face their parents' wrath in the car ride home. You were lucky to win. That was one of your worst performances. You're lucky they couldn't see how bad you really are and that you almost made me look bad. Or the parent may be jealous. And even though that child's holding that big trophy and making that parent look good, there's still something brewing under the surface for that parent, and will scapegoat the kid just for being good. Because that's really what it is about for these narcissistic parents, ultimately, right? It's all about how their child makes them look to the world. These narcissistic parents, they love to talk a big game about how they just want what's best for their kids. And who knows, maybe at some level they actually do want that. But by turning their children into performative puppets who perform at what they want when they want, and then whatever the performance is done, that's when the parent discards the child. This is one of the most damaging dynamics we see in narcissistic families. A parent discarding the child because they no longer need what they're doing for them. Because the child is playing a role for the parent, that's why it's so important for me for you to understand this concept of family roles. In larger families, you can see more and more roles filled, like, everyone kind of gets a role. But in small families, each child may have to play more than one role, and usually will, because that's what kids do. They often typically do what's asked of them. And these roles easily persist into adulthood and may morph. Now, you may have been the golden child all the way through, but the first time you reject the idea of taking on the family business, then bang, you become the invisible child or the scapegoat. You become the ingrate, the petty one, the uppity one, too good to be in the family business, too ungrateful. If you finally evolve into your truth-telling role after years of having been a handmaid or a scapegoat, bang, you go from scapegoat to truth-teller to invisible, and then back to scapegoat real fast. Those poor scapegoats get really stuck in that role. Now remember, in a narcissistic family system, your role, sadly, is to solely substantiate and validate the narcissistic parent. If you don't take that role on, then you will get a role that allows your narcissistic parent to maintain their grandiosity and superiority. No matter what, that role is designed to help your parent, not you. And obviously, these roles can impact sibling relationships. Golden children can become world-class jerks in adulthood. And the scapegoat may recognize that these roles mean that the stunted relationships in childhood become downright toxic in adulthood. For the scapegoats, is the decision of, do they want this role forever? These roles, whether you have 1, 2, or 3, place you at risk for taking on these limited identities in other relationships, again, into adulthood. As noted in each of the individual videos on each of the roles, invisible children, for example, may end up in adult relationships or jobs where they remain unseen, or they may feel more safe being unseen. Scapegoats run the risk of abusive relationships. Handmaids may keep serving others as a means of just keeping a relationship going, and fixers keep fixing and rescuing everyone. Everything, including the new narcissists that they meet in adulthood. So you can see how these roles can make you very vulnerable. And everyone bless the truth tellers. If the anxiety of childhood didn't break their spirits entirely, hopefully they go on to being even bigger truth tellers. But frankly, the lifelong isolation from their family of origin can take a tremendous toll on them and result in an adult life characterized by grief and shame. It's not easy for those truth tellers. I want to hear from all of you, though. What were your roles after hearing this in the hybrid roles? How many did you have? Did they change over your lifetime? Did different parents give you different roles, or did one parent give you 2 roles, one in private, one in public? But as adults, what I want all of you to do, please commit to this, to the things I'm about to ask you. Please shake those roles. We human beings are beautiful for our ability to be us, to be authentic, not to play a role to please other people, but to be true to ourselves. Shake it off, be you, and let your so-called role as an adult be to simply be you. When we look at the work of sort of the humanistic movement and psychologists, the thing that impairs us most, the greatest contributor to so-called dysfunction, is that we don't simply be our true selves. It's almost like all these sandbags that tie us to planet Earth, all the expectations people put on us, all the role demands that they put on us to be the way they need us to be. The minute we can set ourselves free from what other people are demanding of us and allow ourselves to be ourselves, that's when our lives run on time. But when you come, our lives run properly, I should say. But when you come from a narcissistic family system, you existed in a singular capacity. and that was to bring supply to your parent. And you were going to be transformed in whatever way necessary to ensure that as a child, you became a sort of optimized narcissistic supply delivery device, whether that meant making you into some sort of grandiose trophy, shutting you up, ignoring you, or verbally abusing you. That narcissistic parent didn't see you as what you were, a beautiful little spirit, a child that just simply needed someone to mirror them correctly so they could go on and become the authentic adult they could be. It's never too late. The journey is going to be much harder if you had had a narcissistic parent, but it is not impossible. You, as an adult, are the only one who can give yourself permission to authenticate and let that real self out. You may need to leave some people behind, but the thing I want you to leave behind is whatever ridiculous family role you were given. You are bigger than that. So do it. Obviously, we've talked a lot about trauma bonding on this channel. Trauma bonding is that connection, the attachment, if you will, the bond formed through the alternation between good and bad, the conflation of love and chaos, the approach and avoidance, and then the cycle of making rationalizations and justifications and allowances, and the sense of fear at disengaging or setting boundaries, and the sense of shame around staying in it. It's about having the same fights over and over again that never get resolved. It's like this sort of familiar toxic cycles playing over and over again. Now, trauma bonding can originate from two different types of relationships. Those that start just in adulthood, and those that start in childhood. The childhood cycles of trauma bonding are much more sticky and often do go on to shape adult relationships that we get into. But the misconception is that you had to have had the trauma bonding cycle happen in childhood for it to then repeat in adulthood. Not necessarily. You can be from a happy, healthy, safe, and securely attached family of origin and still create a trauma-bonded relationship in adulthood. So let's break some of this down. In childhood, we know the drill. The trauma bonding comes out of the usual suspects. It could be because someone had inconsistent parents, narcissistic parents, unavailable parents, substance-using parents, traumatizing parents, abusive parents, or some combination of the above. And as a child, no child is ever going to view the parent as perpetrator. It's too dangerous and would be a blockade to the essential attachment a child needs desperately met, right? So the child does a reversal and takes responsibility, or somehow doesn't register what's happening as abusive or harmful. They rationalize it. And the child will blame themselves for those bad days. They will cherish the good days and may even construct a grandiose and fantastical version of the idealized parent, and then simultaneously will be fostering a narrative of self that is sometimes good, sometimes bad. Trauma-bonded children are forever on a chase and creation of justified narratives around the parent, and the children are riddled with self-blame and shame. These are children who are often prone to anxiety and obviously to persisting in these cycles. The trauma-bonded cycle makes sense in a way. It keeps the child strangely safe, not having to conceptualize their caregiver as dangerous or bad, but rather as good. And if the child is bad, well, then that would mean that the child could get it together and be better. That's what they tell themselves. In trauma-bonded relationships, the child is not allowed to be themselves. The parent often resents the child for having needs or a sense of self or even an existence outside of the parent. The child is in essence a source of supply or even an extension of the parent, and that's it. If the child needs something more or different, they are viewed as a nuisance or a problem. So the child is forever negating their true selves to be and shape themselves into what the parent needs to ensure those attachment needs are met. These trauma-bonded relationships in childhood set people up with insecure, anxious, and perhaps even avoidant attachment styles going into adulthood. Now, trauma-bonded cycles in childhood can not always, but can and often do replicate in adulthood. And some folks will say, you know, I came out of that as a kid, and when I met someone healthy as an adult, I kind of felt flat and blah, and it didn't feel like love. But when I met that person who was invalidating, and there were the highs and the lows, I was always on my back foot and always wondering who I would get. Well, that felt like love. And that's an unfortunate legacy of these patterns. Now, having experienced trauma-bonded cycles in childhood don't doom you, okay? All is not lost. Therapy, especially trauma-informed therapy, that allows you to unpack these cycles and understand them from an attachment perspective, lift the self-blame and shame, and permit you to start viewing yourself separately from this relationship, as well as educate yourself on these cycles, all make a big difference. However, you can have your first trauma-bonded cycles begin in adulthood, even if nothing happens in childhood, right? It can start in adulthood. Now, most often this will happen in the context of an intimate relationship, but it could also be a friendship or even a workplace relationship. You may even have a fully secure attachment, and then in adulthood, you may meet someone who actually does all the cycles, dynamics, and dance of a narcissistic relationship, the manipulation, the invalidation, the dismissiveness, the gaslighting, you know the drill. But all of this, as you know, all that bad stuff's happening, and their entitlement and their lack of empathy and their arrogance and their all of that's happening against that back and forth between good days and happy days and fun and love, and then boom, bad days. And then when that happens, it's well, it was great over the weekend, or gosh, when we first met, it was wonderful, and I'm so into them, and I'm sure we can make it better, and maybe I'm the one who's not trying hard enough, and relationships are hard, and I need to take responsibility for my part. When it happens for the first time in adulthood, we get these sort of higher order takes on it. It's less of the I am bad, they're good, I need to survive, but rather, I can see the cool stuff about this person, and I want this to work, and it's hard to meet new people, or I love this job, or I want to be a good friend. Again, it's not that primal stuff. And as we have discussed, that happy family of origin story of yours can mean that you believe, oh, listen, if I'm just really nice and helpful and let them know I love them and that I care and I'll work harder, then all of this is going to be fine. It's not the childhood idea of relationships are chaos and chaos is love, but rather that relationships are good, and so let's do this and just be good. Adult trauma-bonded relationships will often have more of a rescuing, problem-solving vibe to them. And while adult trauma-bonded relationships are less primitive and almost more cognitive, they can still, as many of you know, really do a number on you. A person who endures an abusive boss, it's the first time it's happening for you in adulthood, may believe that, I just need to show up and do a great job because I want to stay at this great company. Or it could be a person who has a toxic friend that they meet in adulthood and they stick it out and they're like, we went to college together and we do all this stuff together and we take trips together. They're my partner in crime, right? And in the romantic relationships where we see this sort of adult trauma-bonded cycle start most commonly, again, the narcissistic relationships often have a lot of good stuff and more than enough to keep you enthralled and excited. Your narcissistic partner may tick lots of boxes. And since it does take a year or two to really see these relationships clearly, you may already have a lot of sunk cost. You may live together, be engaged, or even be married or have kids. When it comes to healing, even if a relationship starts in adulthood, your first time at the trauma-bonded dance is adulthood, it's still really challenging. However, adult trauma-bonded relationships, from a treatment perspective, can often heal quite a bit through psychoeducation. People are taught the patterns, taught about radical acceptance, you recognize it's not going to change. There may be some initial resistance to this in an adult trauma-bonded relationship, but it's not that primal, held in your body attachment to the push and pull of the trauma-bonded relationship. Some people will say, well, maybe I'm not trauma-bonded because this didn't happen to me in childhood. No, sadly, it can happen at any age. The ramifications may be different, but the sense of stuckness, confusion, despair, self-blame, anxiety, and helplessness are pretty similar regardless of when these trauma-bonded relationships originate. So it is important to recognize these two sort of paths of origin can result in different experience. Are there people out there who have the childhood experience and then in adulthood manage to get into a healthier relationship? It is. But if that doesn't get worked on, those adult invalidating relationships, and the person gets lucky and meets someone nice in adulthood, it still has to get addressed because our intimate partner is not our own relationship. It could show up in a friendship or a workplace thing. So that childhood stuff does need to get worked through. And then for most people, the classical cycles, it happens in childhood and it happens in adulthood. But for those of you that your first time at this rodeo was in adulthood, it's still trauma bonding. It just might be a slightly different pattern of healing. I know that many people watching this channel have or had a narcissistic parent or parents, and it is a rough ride. You had to silence yourself to grow up like this. You had to shapeshift who you are, who you wanted to be, and what they wanted you to be. You learned to either be useful or stay out of the way or be what they needed you to be. You learned to silence your needs, your preferences, your hopes, your aspirations, and your sense of self. A childhood like this meant bouncing between guilt, fear, sadness, anxiety, glimpses of good days when perhaps things were going well for the narcissistic parent, and even as you grew into adolescence and then adulthood, it was clear that you were either just an extension of them or an inconvenience, and you may have become accustomed to manipulations that would play upon guilt and either manipulative gambits such as how much was sacrificed for you, or how you have had it so much easier than they did, or how you owe them so much. Narcissistic parents can run one way or another. One is that they become completely detached and disinterested once you hit adulthood. And that may be because then they have other sources of supply or things that keep them busy. Or they remain over-involved with terrible boundaries and may even leave you feeling bad or guilty for wanting to pursue your own interests or move away. While in more severe cases of childhood narcissistic abuse, it may be major boundary violations that clearly qualify as abuse and may even culminate in post-traumatic stress or complex trauma. That certainly happens in a subset of cases, and it's a heavier set of clinical issues for the client and any therapist working with them. However, for the vast majority of folks who experience childhood narcissistic abuse, it's at that moderate or mild moderate level. And you, watching this video, may even be in this situation. Many people may look back at these childhoods and say, it was uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing and unhappy and confusing, and I even felt ashamed because my family just felt so weird and uncomfortable. You may look back and wish that your parents would have been more engaged or noticed you or had interest in you or interest in your aspirations or who you were or just liked you for who you were. And you may look back and resent that your parents' needs always came first, that vacations were taken in the name, if you even took them, but if they were taken in the name of what your parent was interested in, or dinner was at a time that worked for the narcissistic parent, or the narcissistic parent had little interest in anyone else in the family, but expected the family to drop what they were doing and go pay homage when the narcissistic parent wanted to share something or just hold court. You may have witnessed betrayal, such as a narcissistic parent cheating on your other parent, or do shady stuff with money, or the way they did their work or their job. But you may not have ever thought to use the word abuse to describe your childhood. You may have felt that the word abuse, especially in childhood, was really reserved for people who had experienced some form of physical abuse or violation, that it resulted in bruises. This is not meant to be a video about the semantics of the word abuse. Many people don't feel that they have the right to use it, even when, in the vast majority of these cases, it clearly does apply. Abuse isn't about intensity, but also duration. And while I agree that most mental health folks or even lay people will not classify one episode of invalidation from another person as abuse, when that kind of invalidation happens every single day, especially during a person's childhood, as a sense of self develops, I'm going to argue that it would qualify. But what about the other thing that narcissistic parents do? Using their own child to sort of regulate. So the parent sharing problems with a child, becoming passive aggressive if you as a child didn't give them your full attention. I remember one person telling me that when she was around like 5 or 6, she had had a tough day at school and was just feeling a little down. And her father had done something around the house and wanted her to admire something he had done. He had fixed something. I think it was like made a shelf or something. And she was 5. She was 5, guys, okay? 5, and having a bad day. And she just sort of looked at it and sort of shrugged and didn't really care. It's not a 5-year-old's job to care, least of all about a home repair. She recalled her narcissistic father just going off on her for not admiring his new shelf enough. These are the parents that will become sullen if you don't admire them enough, or they will scream, just like it happened with this gal, if you don't respond the way they want to their wonderful thing, or they will ruin a child's special day because a parent themselves is having a bad day. These poor kids, the narcissistic parent might make them a birthday cake, and if the child doesn't admire it enough, forget it. I personally think that that's emotional misuse. Listen, if an adult is having a bad day and wants to have a sullen tantrum with another adult, that's still not great, but the other adult could handle it. But using a child as a sounding board or to regulate or to hold the parent's disappointment or sadness, that's the misuse of a child. It's not what a child's psyche is designed to handle. Children are not made to soothe their parents or reassure them or fill their egos or take care of them. Children have enough damn stuff to do to learn, especially in the world we're in now, to just become themselves than have to be subjugated and relegated to having to take care of a damned parent. That, to me, is a misuse of the child. I am sure many think, nah, it's abuse, and I tend to agree with you. But for those of you out there who think, well, maybe a parent just over-relying or leaning on a child, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's just not what a child's made for, asking them to do what they're not designed to do. Sure, and that's where, okay, then use the damn word misuse. It's all semantics. I'm always trying to help survivors find language that will get them out of those kinds of loops of justification and rationalization and will capture the essence of when you have a narcissistic parent, regardless of what that parent's backstory is, and I know many, many parents out there have had tough backstories, but that to subjugate a child for the parent's needs, you want to call it abuse or simply term it, like what I'm saying, emotional misuse. It's not what a child is designed to handle. And the narcissistic person is not able to discriminate between a child or other adults. The narcissistic person just needs supply, and they're going to get it from wherever they can. Anyhow, I have no doubt that many of you, many of us, were emotionally misused when we were kids by the narcissists around us. You were asked to step up and endure psychological stuff in a way that your psyches and your minds were simply not prepared to do, that no child is designed to do. The healing for someone coming out of narcissistic abuse like this is about recognizing none of this is your fault. You're not to blame. And that you never need, even as an adult, to be another person's tool of regulation. Another person using you to soothe themselves, even in adulthood, to me that qualifies as emotional misuse and in most cases also abuse. Fully formed adults regulate themselves and have reciprocal interactions with other adults when they need to work something through. You talk it out in a balanced way, and both people hear each other. But narcissistic adults sort of view everyone as pacifiers to turn to when they need to calm down. I hope that framing helps. Just more language to talk about this, and whether you call this misuse, abuse, for this to happen to a child, and frankly, even to an adult, to be basically a human pacifier because a narcissistic person cannot put on their big person psychological pants. None of us are designed for that. And it's time that we hold people who are damn adults, hold their feet to the fire and say, figure it out and stop taking it out on other people, least of all children. Let's talk a little bit about verbal abuse in childhood and what it does to a kid. Because you might think to yourself, well, do you really need to do research to figure out that verbal abuse is not good for a child? No, but a group of people did. And I think what they found really matters, and it really matters for us to understand how narcissistic parents can affect children. This is a big week for me to read a lot of literature this week, and I was reading a very interesting research study that was conducted by Shanta Dubé and her colleagues at a place called Wingate University. And in this study, they did something called a meta-analysis, and they reviewed lots of studies about childhood verbal abuse, a child being verbally abused by a parent, caregiver, even a teacher. I was drawn to read the article because it's such a universal pattern in people who have antagonistic narcissistic parents in childhood, right? And the authors were really focused on making a very interesting distinction. They wanted to treat childhood verbal abuse as something that's a part of but distinct from childhood emotional abuse. And they were clear to point out that childhood emotional abuse is almost like a much bigger umbrella that takes in more territory, but it includes other things like the silent treatment, neglect, a child being raised in a home in which they're exposed to domestic violence, indifference, a parent simply just not caring about them, right? Childhood verbal abuse is obviously a huge part of that whole larger childhood emotional abuse pie. The screaming, the humiliating, the use of exploitative language, manipulative language, scapegoating language. Again, enough of you who had narcissistic parents survived this to know what that part of it is. So the people who did this research find that the long-term effects of this childhood verbal abuse include depression, anxiety, in some cases PTSD, a greater risk of problematic substance use, and even suicidal thoughts. So the verbal abuse in childhood, they were able to show across these many, many studies, can harm a person's mental health well into adulthood. And given the severity, depends on how severe the verbal abuse was, some folks may even experience fallout consistent with complex trauma. Now, by and large, when people have antagonistic or narcissistic parents, the downstream effect in adulthood is most prominently negative mood states such as anxiety or depression. Now, interestingly, according to the research at large, they pointed out something that this was quite telling to me. They pointed out that the World Health Organization found that physical and sexual abuse rates have fallen, while rates of emotional abuse have increased. And this is probably a combination of greater enforcement of reporting laws around abuse, greater consequence for people who abuse children, and more overall awareness. The realist in me would say that people are still abusing their children and finding a way to do it that's less easy to pin down and then get reported on. The emotional abuse, instead of in ways that it doesn't leave as many observable scars, I would argue that kids are still being abused as much as they always were. Almost none of this research ever examines, though, the personalities of the parents. They will document that a child was abused and understandably focus on the child, the well-being and the outcomes of the child. So we can't make a definitive statement that a certain percent of people who harm a child also have an antagonistic personality. We know it's multi-determined who abuses a child, with factors contributing to this kind of behavior, including stuff like the parent's own history of trauma, the parent's own history of being abused by their parents and caregivers, even cultural norms about parenting, things like alcohol and drug use, social causes like poverty, and the stresses associated with all of these things, right? All of that said, what we do know about anything is personality is a constant drumbeat that sounds under behavior. I sincerely hope someone does the research. This is not easy research to do, to think about parental personality. But I would guess if someone did do the research, that a significant proportion, if not the majority, of parents and caregivers who chronically abuse children likely do have some form of antagonistic personality, dysregulated, entitled, unempathic, exploitative, manipulative, blame-shifting. It tracks. And if that's the case, it also makes the case that having an antagonistic parent would not be good for a child's health. Because antagonistic parents, yes, narcissistic parents, are far more likely to verbally abuse their children. And that means the long-term effects in those children as they come into adulthood that these researchers were finding in their exploration of all of these studies. Now, where the article sort of lost me, and I understand from a science perspective why they have to say this, because they have to be able to, the work has to apply into other situations, is to take what they have learned about childhood verbal abuse, this thing that it's a thing and it's not good for children and ultimately not good for those children when they become adults. And one thing that these authors say is, like, we have to address primary prevention. We have to stop verbal abuse from happening in the first place. And that means that the adults, the parents, the caregivers, need to stop yelling at the kids. Can that realistically happen? One could argue, well, hey, the rates of other forms of abuse dropped, so why not? Well, it's complicated to figure out why the rates of those other forms of abuse dropped and the other emotional abuse increased. But again, abusers are going to abuse, especially when they're antagonistic. That's not going to change. And emotional abuse and verbal abuse are all but impossible to legally punish. If the definition of child abuse were expanded to include verbal and emotional abuse, the courts, law enforcement, child services, and social services would literally have to hire thousands and thousands more people to manage what would come their way. It's not realistic, and it's never going to happen. Certainly, a subset of parents who may not be antagonistic could be trained and taught to dial down the emotional abuse if they were less stressed, had more support, more resources, more help. Where the hell those resources are going to come from? That's never going to happen. So let's keep it real. There's really no pathway here. Some people talk about parent training, teaching parents that yelling at their kids is not okay, and teaching the parents other responses. That might help in some percentage of cases, but you got to get those parents into the training. But when we sift out to the narcissistic and antagonistic parents, there's no training. There are no resources, there are no supports, other than someone else coming along and fully taking responsibility for raising the children, that will fix it. We know that these personality styles are very resistant to change. They're also very reactive when the person is stressed. And it may simply be that the consequence of other forms of abuse, like, for example, being punished, and all those other things would happen if a parent engaged in physical violence. But those antagonistic parents are still engaging in the emotional and verbal violence, which carry the harms of all abuse and violence. And that's the rub. Antagonism and parenting do not mix. The requirements of parenting, eternal patience, self-sacrifice, chronically putting another person's needs before your own, constant compromise, and very high levels of self-regulation are literally impossible for a narcissistic person. I really commend the researchers on this article. It was a very important one. It's one that I am going to keep as a reference, and we'll put a link to a summary of it in the video notes if it's something you want to read further and learn more about. If you're a therapist, this article should be required reading. And teasing out the separate effects of verbal abuse is important. Emotional abuse is, in fact, a very big umbrella that takes in a lot of territory. But when it comes down to it, we cannot talk about verbal abuse, and frankly, any form of abuse of children, without talking about antagonism or narcissism. because it is often a reason why so many of the family violence prevention interventions may not always work, especially when it comes to emotional abuse. Simply attempting to teach antagonistic and narcissistic parents to better regulate their emotions is not something that is ever going to happen at a population scale. Antagonistic narcissistic parents fully overtake and overwhelm their children. They view their kids as either someone that should never inconvenience them or make them look good, or that is there to attend to the parents' needs. And when that child ever expresses their own needs, wants, hopes, interests, true selves, the narcissistic parent will either shut it down or respond to it variably. For example, show interest and then pull away when they can't be bothered. Or they may say things that will leave the child feeling as though that they're the one, the child themselves is the one who's entitled and demanding and out of line. The verbal abuse is a subsection of the larger landscape of what happens to children in these sorts of personality environments. And the lifetime of self-doubt, self-blame, confusion that follow all of this is part of that too. And keep in mind that the parents don't just have no effect just because you got older. Narcissistic parents may keep up with their problematic behavior for a lifetime. And while you have different options and recourse when you're an adult, inside all of us is a child when we do encounter an invalidating parent, no matter what age we are. And that verbal abuse that scared us as kids still bruises us as adults. We hold it in our bodies and magnifies the likelihood of lots of poor outcomes. Listen, this research in many ways is telling most of us something we probably already knew, especially if you survived a childhood like this. But the more research that gets done on this, each day we may get a little bit closer to an attempt to try to address these things at a larger level. But it also means that we have to have the will to also account for the impacts of personality on these findings. And to me, that's really the next innovative horizon in this kind of work.